Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Solari Report. Today we have a guest who needs no introduction here, Dr. Mark Skidmore, economics professor from Michigan State University, who once upon a time said to me, "How can I help?" And the rest is history. So Dr. Skidmore just published at missingmoney.solari.com a new update to the missing money. And I wanted to get him back to tell us what happened, what he learned, describe the report that we have up at Missing Money, and what it means to you and me. So with no further ado, Dr. Mark Skidmore, welcome back to the Solari Report.
Really appreciate being able to talk a little bit more about these interesting issues and times.
So tell us about the report. It started with you FOIAing the Department of Defense. Tell us how you came to submit a FOIA and what was the information you requested in the FOIA. Take us back to your prior report and how it moved up to that.
Sure. Okay. So you and I had worked together for quite some time collecting the government reports, compiling them, organizing, all of which is on your Missing Money website. And then out of that, we did get a fair amount of media exposure, some of which was really helpful and a lot of which wasn't very helpful. And so I think it was in early 2019, Dave Lindorf published a piece about the missing money in the nation. And in response to all of that, I had along the way asked him, make sure that you do a FOIA request for a particular set of information. And I'll talk about that in a moment, because this might give you something to triangulate with, something concrete that you can base some of your findings and conclusions, whatever they happen to be, on.
And I should just stop you for a second and mention, for those who don't know what FOIA means, it's Freedom of Information Act. So it's an act that gives a citizen authority, or someone like Dr. Skidmore, the ability to request information that should be available to citizens. Sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Sure, yeah. And so he assured me that he would do that as part of his investigation. And so he, as he was interviewing top government officials at the GAO and the OI, General Accountability Office, the Office of the Inspector General, et cetera. So he was collecting different kind of interview-based information from folks, and then the article finally came out, and he told me he really had to push the editor to get the article out. He was going to take it somewhere else because he was getting frustrated. And then when it came out, I asked him, I said, you didn't mention anything about a Freedom of Information Act request or obtaining any of that information that I had referred to. And I asked him, did you do a FOIA request? And he didn't answer me on that question. And I think I asked him about 4 times. Finally, he said, I didn't have the support on the legal side that I had hoped for, and I never submitted a FOIA request. And I was very frustrated at that point. And I said, what?
I remember you as being very shocked because you were highly confident that he had.
Yeah, I thought he had, but he didn't. And I thought to myself, so your entire article is based only on what people told you and no actual data points or anything. And he ended up winning a national award for that piece, but he didn't submit a FOIA request. He didn't try to get any of, a handle on any of the underlying information. So I would have done the FOIA request earlier, but, I was sort of leaning on him and what he had said. And so in July of 2019, I submitted a FOIA request. And here's what I asked for. In the Army report, which came out in 2016 for fiscal year 2015, the Army, and I think most of your subscribers are aware of this, had indicated that there were $6.5 trillion in unsupported adjustments. These are unverified transactions, and you think to yourself, how in the world could that be? The Army's budget in that year, the general fund budget, was $122 billion. How could you get $6.5 trillion, right? So in that report, there's one piece that said there are 170 adjustments that tallied to $2.1 trillion. So $2.1 trillion is not a whole lot smaller than the Canadian economy. It's huge, right? And so I asked for information about those 170 unverified transactions, and what the Army said they were for, and why the Office of the Inspector General considered them to be unsupported.
Now, let me mention one thing, which is the genius if you're figuring out 170 transactions. Traditionally, the way the U.S. government has protected is to say, oh, it's very complicated. There are millions of transactions, da-da-da-da-da. The beauty of this one, because they had affirmed in their own documentation that it was only, quote unquote, 170 transactions, the excuse that they can't find it or produce it because it's an overwhelming amount of stuff kind of goes away.
Yeah.
How hard can it be to do 170, to provide the evidence on 170 transactions?
I mean, if I were producing a report like that and it were of these magnitudes, I would feel compelled to provide some more information. The existing reports are very cursory. It's like, oh, well, there's 2 trillion here, a trillion there, tallying to 6.5 trillion. It's like, what? That's a third of the GDP of the entire United States coming from a budget of 122 billion. It's just it's like fingers on a chalkboard, and no questions are being asked. And so I submitted that request, and it took them months. It went around to the OIG, to the Indianapolis office, down to the Army, and down in Arkansas. And maybe I'll allow you to tell the story about the Arkansas.
So it went to Alabama.
Oh, Alabama, yeah.
It went to Alabama, and it was, well, let me just go back and look at it. Say all the documents that are involved in this are listed on your report at missingmoney.solari.com. And anyway, right. So during the early 2000s, I was working with someone who ran a website for a former intelligence officer who claimed to be good at, or his beat was financial fraud. And the guy was really, one thing, I spent a lot of time talking to him about financial fraud, and I will say this, whoever he was and wherever he came from, he did really know a lot about financial fraud. Anyway, but they used to publish articles on Redstone Arsenal and all the illegal arms sales going out the back door of Redstone Arsenal in Alabama. And I would read these things and I would never know what to think. And one day I was up at the webmaster's home. I was on my way out to Kalispell, Montana, and this guy had a place in Montana. So he said, wait a minute, I'm putting up an article. Come look at my web stats. And he had real-time live. You could see who's coming into the website. And that was the day when you could still see the specific ISP, so you could identify exactly who was coming in. So this happened several times when I was there. He would put up an article, and the next thing you know, it was Goldman Sachs and Brothers. It was all the big Wall Street firms coming in to figure out, who's getting what money. I figured they probably wanted to make cold calls. And, I started to realize, all this funny business may be going on at Redstone Arsenal. Now, if you look at what the different operations traditionally have been at Redstone Arsenal, the idea that they would be dealing with this FOIA, I just started laughing. I couldn't believe. I thought, the Redstone is probably being punished, and it's their job to come up with some phony explanation of what this all is. Anyway, so it was just very amusing to me that it got there.
Well, so it went to the Redstone Arsenal and then back to the OIG. And finally, after several months, early in 2020, I got a response with a listing of, in a PDF document of 170 adjustments with the amounts for each adjustment and a brief explanation of why it was considered unsupported. Now, the explanations aren't very detailed or in depth, and in fact, a lot of them were just cut off, so you can't really see exactly what is going on. And so I organize them, put them into a spreadsheet, and then just in the report that you see on the Solari website, you can see the top 10 adjustments, some of which are in the trillion or billions of dollars. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But the descriptions are sort of vague, and so you could think of them as plugs. This is the term that Dave Lindorf used in his article that appeared in The Nation. There's a $116 billion adjustment that indicates it was done to bring balances into agreement. There's an $88 billion adjustment that says to clear abnormal balances. An $86 billion adjustment indicates errors and reasonableness checks. There's one adjustment for $163 billion that indicates that there was the customer was unable to provide, and then the explanation is cut off, so you can't really see what the explanation is. So, so if these were in the millions of dollars, that would be a substantial amount just to overlook. But, in the context of an Army budget of just $122 billion, how can you get a $163 billion adjustment, unsupported, an unverified transaction, and the explanation is the customer is unable to provide some sort of information?
Right, so, and we have no access to banking data.
No.
So that would tell us how much of the 120, if the Army had a $122 billion budget year, how much money flowed out of those accounts, and how does it compare to some of these adjustments? We have no access such as that. And of course, the push to audit the Fed might give us some of the access, but it hasn't happened.
Right. So, so the bottom line is the unverified transactions are enormous, and the descriptions, if they were smaller amounts, might seem reasonable, but when it's $163 billion for one transaction, and it just says the customer was unable to provide information, you have to ask yourself, well, what in the world could that be? And this is where, under a typical circumstance, I think an auditor would go start tracking things down. There would be an inquiry, and he would walk all the way through to identify what exactly happened and why.
Right.
And to my knowledge, that doesn't happen. It just is reported, and then you're done.
Well, but here's what's interesting. What has been happening for over 20 years now is that the